Um, so I want to start just by acknowledging that although we are meeting virtually, we acknowledge that Life Science Ontario operates on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, which have cared for the land for thousands of years, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat peoples, and we recognize the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land remains the home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and is subject to the dish with one spoon wampum, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land today. You may live and work in different territories, so we encourage you to reflect on the land on which you're located, and to consider your relationship to the land and to the people who are the traditional keepers of the land. Life Sciences Ontario is committed to the principles of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. But we recognize this commitment is a process, and part of that process is engaging in respectful, honest, and oftentimes uncomfortable conversations. These are necessary for advancing our understanding and our behavior. And today, we will be exploring inequities to accessing vaccines and healthcare. The pandemic has shown that many communities have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and often access to vaccines have not reflected these areas most in need. But we also recognize this didn't just happen suddenly during the pandemic. Inequities, mistrust, and systemic racism have been present in Canadian healthcare for far too long and have been exposed more publicly during this pandemic. Today's panel will share their insights and experience surrounding these inequities, some of the root causes, and what can be done to achieve a healthcare system that is truly equitable and accessible for everyone. It's my great pleasure to hand it over to our moderator for today's session, Allison Sekuler, Vice President Research of Baycrest Health Sciences. Allison, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jason, and thank you to you and to Life Sciences Ontario for hosting this really critical conversation this morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Allison Sekuler. I'm the Vice President Research at Baycrest Health Sciences and the Managing Director for the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation. And I, in my various roles across the last 35 years professionally, I've been deeply involved in a number of issues related to inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And among other roles right now, I currently serve as the Executive Co-Lead for the Ontario Hospital Association Anti-Racism Task Force. I've also seen the devastating effect of COVID, both through my own work on the direct and indirect effects of COVID in the brain, and in working in the seniors care sector, which was obviously really severely impacted by COVID. But as Jason noted, it's really important to note that all communities were not equally affected. Indigenous communities, Black communities, communities of color, and other vulnerable communities were significantly more impacted than others. And when the vaccine started rolling out, these communities also had less access to and less uptake of the vaccine than others. And although these health inequities clearly were apparent during the pandemic, they are not new by any chance. And although today we'll be talking about the root causes of these inequities, we also want to think forward to what can be done to address them through this pandemic and beyond. And we're really fortunate to have a terrific panel to address the issues from diverse perspectives this morning. Joining us today, we have Aaron Chuckalingham, who's the Professor of Medicine and Global Health at the University of Toronto, Stephen Jackson, CEO of the Anishinaabe Outreach, Employment and Training Incorporated, Akwatu Kente, who is an assistant professor at the Dalalana School of Public Health, University of Toronto, and affiliate scientist of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, or CAMH. He's also a special advisor to the City of Toronto's targeted COVID Equity Action Plan and the chair of the Black Scientists Task Force on Vaccine Equity. And last but certainly not least, we have Suzanne Charles Watson, who's the Director of Equity, Anti-Racism, and Indigenous Initiatives for the City of Kitchener. And what we'd like to do is really just start it off with introductory statements from each of those panelists where you each speak a little bit to your own background, the perspective that you bring to the conversation, and what you think one of the most critical issues is from your perspective. And Stephen, let's get started with you.
Okay. So in terms of my background, as you mentioned, Allison, CEO for Anishinaabe Outreach. It's an Indigenous organization located in Kitchener, Waterloo. Well, it's in Kitchener, but our service region is Guelph, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo. And we serve many Indigenous people. And we have like multiple services. It's spirit bundles, which really helps Indigenous families get through the pandemic. Mental health, of course, and new employment and mentoring programs that we've launched. And I think one of the most significant things that we did, in addition to building our healing lodges and our teaching lodges and our pollinator gardens, was really hosting vaccination clinics for Indigenous people in the region. And I think everything that we do is focused on helping Indigenous people heal and move forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Let's turn next to Akwatu.
Hi, good morning to all, and thank you so much for this privilege and opportunity. My background is in mental health and addictions. I've been working in the field for about 25 years, 30 years now, and building primary care capacity has been my focus across the world, many parts of the world, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And that experience really has raised my awareness of stigma, and not just stigma in the public, but stigma amongst health professionals, which in fact has led to poor quality of care for people with mental health and addictions the world over. I've sort of translated my understanding of stigma to the issue of race, and because the same issues applied for racial stigma. And it's because of the public stigma and the experiences of racial stigma that many racialized groups now express vaccine hesitancy. And so the stigma reduction techniques, which I've been using for the past 5 to 10 years to try to reduce stigma among health professionals, especially mental health professionals, surprisingly, is the same approaches myself and my colleagues have been using to address vaccine hesitancy across racialized communities, but particularly Black communities in Southern Ontario. And which is really a sort of a brief motivational approach where you don't escalate, you don't argue, you provide the evidence so that people can identify the discrepancies for themselves. But and the aim really is to build the efficacy of the individual to make an informed decision. Whether or not they choose to get the vaccine or don't get the vaccine, they have the information about the vaccine from a science-based perspective, as well as any other perspective, social media perspective, WhatsApp, which is sort of the main purveyor of a lot of the misinformation. But they can weigh what they're hearing on the social media with what science says and come to their own decision. And that's what I've been doing, and that's the kind of experience I'll be speaking to.
Perfect, thanks so much. Next, Suzanne, let's hear from you about your perspective and background.
So thank you. It's a pleasure to join this wonderful panel this morning. My background starts from gender and equity studies. So the lens that I bring is how do we examine structural inequities? How do we look at the social determinants of health? How do we look at how historically marginalized groups have had to navigate a system that has very often been biased against them, has been active, trying to block access. So that's going to be the focus that I have today. And I've always found it interesting as the progression of COVID-19, as we've seen it sort of develop. People always say, oh, we're in this together. And I always correct people to say, we're not in the same boat, we're all in the same storm. And how we navigate that looks very different based on where we sit in terms of our social location. So those are some of the issues I'd want to tease out today.
Terrific, very well said. And finally, let's hear from our fourth panelist, Aaron Chucklingham. You're mute. Oh, you're on mute. That has to happen at least one time every Zoom session. So now we've done that.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be part of this exclusive panel. Yeah, my name is Arun Chokalingam. I'm currently a professor of medicine and global health at University of Toronto. I had a good fortune to have varied experience. Lived in Canada for the last 45 years. Lived coast to coast. Started my life in Newfoundland. Went to Ottawa as a medical advisor to Health Canada, and then to Vancouver. And then from there, I was invited by the Obama government to be the founding director of global health at US NIH. After 5 years of that stint, I came back to Canada. This time I decided to live in Toronto here. So that's my background. But in this process, I had the opportunity to visit many countries and to see public health in action at the ground level and see the equities which we are talking about is quite different in different countries. And when you talk about inequities, it exists across and within countries. And even within countries, there are so much of disparities. And it can be, the disparities can be in any aspect of social determinants. And today, when we focus on the vaccines, I would like to bring a particular perspective of the information, the scientific information, and the misinformation, as Akwatu very well put together. The misinformation and disinformation is what is causing people to have vaccine hesitancy. So that's what I'm hoping to connect with you today.
Thank you so much. And it's really interesting because we've started in the introductions from some solutions that were quite local. Stephen talking about setting up a vaccine clinic, for example, and moved all the way to the global. But even the global, as Aaron mentions, comes back to the local in some ways because you've got the disparities both across and within countries. What we'd like to do is to allow the audience to be able to answer some questions, and you can do that by asking your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring that. In the meantime, I'll kick it off maybe by asking you, Stephen, to speak a little bit more about some of the issues that you raised at the very beginning. We're still seeing the effects of centuries of trauma and tragedy today in Indigenous communities, and that has understandably led to continued and massive distrust of the systems, including healthcare systems. And related to Aaron's point, one size fits all solutions around the world or even across our country don't necessarily seem to always be the answer. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what role you think local leaders and community groups can play in addressing these specific issues instead of or in addition to those broader approaches.
Okay, and before I get there, I'm just going to talk about sort of what the issues actually are.
Absolutely, please, yeah.
And sort of what reconciliation is. I think that's an important understanding. And I'm just going to talk about our region, but our region is indicative of many regions across Canada. I think they're synonymous. For us, healthcare tells us that we have 50,000 Indigenous people living in our region, which includes Guelph. And Stats Canada says the number is 20,000. So obviously 30,000 people are not willing to admit they're Indigenous because of the risks associated with being, so they hide in plain sight, dye their hair blonde, things like that. If they're light skinned, it's easy to hide. In our region, 50% of our homeless population is Indigenous. 30% of our prison population across the country is Indigenous. Somewhere between 65 and 95% of our children in care are Indigenous. There's a 500% higher dropout rate for Indigenous versus non-Indigenous students in our education systems. And I saw a stat the other day that said only 4 out of 10 on reserve actually make it to grade 12. There's addictions, poverties, food insecurities, reserves, many or a number of them don't even have safe drinking water. There's massive system avoidance, whether it's police, education, healthcare, family and children's services, and I would even add church and state to that list. There are systemic barriers pretty much everywhere, whether it's for employment or whether it's in these organizations. There's missing and murdered, and there's trafficked girls and women. And of course, we have the discoveries of residential schools that, I'm not saying they're happening daily, but in the past 3 weeks, I think there's like a good 4 or 5. So it's, in terms of the issues and the traumas, yeah, there's 500 years of this. And what it does is, I'm not saying the Indigenous people didn't do these things, and yeah, they did, but it's caused by trauma. And from our perspective, when we look at what are the issues or what are we trying to move forward, most of the time people are treating symptoms as opposed to root cause. Root cause is the trauma, of course. The symptom is homelessness or addictions or something else. You need to get to the root cause before you actually treat the other issues. And from our perspective, reconciliation, really as it's defined by Justice Sinclair, was justice and healing, but it needs to include healing and economic independence, because if you focus on justice, you'll never get out of that mindset. But healing is really the solution to ameliorate most of these issues that I just described a few minutes ago. And I'm just going to get to your actual question now. What was your actual question? Sorry about that. It was...
Oh, no worries. I think that's really important to provide that background context, because that leads into it, which is that given all of what you've been talking about, it's pretty clear that there wouldn't be a one-size solution to address health inequity for every different person in Canada, and even within Indigenous communities, it may differ from community to community depending on regional impacts and so on. Black community versus Indigenous community, do you see the role for local leaders like yourself? You mentioned starting a vaccine clinic locally, for example. What's the importance of that local approach as opposed to a one-size-fits-all or a more global approach?
Well, and I think this was probably the first time Indigenous people have been, I'm not going to say they were put first, but they were put closer to the front of the line as opposed to the back of the line for first doses, and of course for second doses. The period was greatly reduced, and even for the children, the Indigenous children got their vaccines before any other children or youth got their vaccines. And it's got to be a partnership, and that's the only way it worked. There is no trust for these systems or these groups. Plainly put, I don't believe healthcare can, or other organizations can actually deliver the service without an Indigenous partner supporting it, because while we might have the trust, there would be no trust for the systems. And even, I mean, and it doesn't matter where you go, there's discrimination, there's racism, there's like just those comments every time you go into a public space or get challenged with everything, right? And as much as we might read the news, Indigenous news is Facebook, it's social media, and all these things circulate around. You see it on social, you see the flare-ups on social media way before it ever makes the news, right?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And I think following from that, Okwatu, you also talked about some of these issues around stigma that Stephen's been talking about. And I wonder, if you can speak to this from your perspective, because members of the Black community also continue to face discrimination and lack of access to healthcare systems. And as you've noticed, they also have an understandable mistrust in the healthcare systems. And at the same time, they've been among the most impacted, along with Indigenous communities and older individuals and others by COVID. And I'm wondering, in your role as chair of the Black Scientist Task Force on Vaccine Equity and special advisor to the city, what advice are you actually giving to address some of these urgent issues in health inequity right now? Sorry, you're on mute also.
I put on the mute because my children are having difficulty with the technology, and they came into the room trying to get me to go and help. I said, no, I can't. Yeah, so we share many parallels with the Indigenous community. And one of them is historical mistrust. You know, when we did surveys of people who come to our town halls and we asked them, you know, what's their thinking on vaccines, what's their thinking on COVID, what's their trusted sources of information, why are they hesitant around the vaccines? And the number one reason is historical mistrust, which doesn't even appear on the radar of non-racialized Canadians. We share with non-racialized Canadians the idea that safety is an issue. That's one of the key concerns. It's not the top concern, one of the concerns. And the vaccines were produced too quickly. And people think that the vaccine producers cut corners in producing the vaccines. And what we tell people is that we must not ignore science-based information. You can't throw out the baby with the bathwater because it's two different things. And without science or without evidence, we wouldn't even know how impacted we have been by COVID. I don't know if people, and you know, one of the things I remind people that March 2020, one of the biggest myths was that Black people are immune to COVID. That was actually an urban legend going all over the place, that they're immune to COVID. They're not gonna get COVID. And then the British actor Idris Elba got COVID, and that shattered that illusion of immunity. And he actually was tweeting out and because he's a social media user, that stop the nonsense, stop relying on Facebook and WhatsApp for your perspectives and start looking at what's actually going on with COVID. So because of race-based data, which we didn't want to collect initially, and which some jurisdictions still don't collect because they don't think it's important enough. But we now know who's most affected by COVID because of that. We know that South Asians, Latinos, and Blacks in Toronto, the city of Toronto, have had the hugest sort of COVID impacts in terms of positivity, hospitalization, and mortality. And we know why. It's because they're doing the essential work, precariously employed, low income wages, and they cannot afford to either miss a paycheck or work from home, right? And most of them don't have a car, so they use public transit, which increases the risk. They work in congregate settings or places that you can't really socially isolate yourself to that degree. But we also know what works. Equity works. You know, there's 4 T's in terms of what keeps people from becoming vaccinated and rushing to the line and finding a vaccine and vaccine hunters and getting there and getting that vaccine. Time, you don't have the time. Can't take the time off work, and when you come home from work, you're too tired. Sometimes, and it's sometimes too late for clinics that close at 6. Transportation, you know, getting to the vaccine clinic on time and back to home or back to, because, you know, we have a lot of female house people who lead the houses or so anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Time, transportation, technology. Many people don't have computers. Below 20,000 income earners don't have, a lot of them don't have computers, or if they have computers, they don't have the bandwidth, the Wi-Fi to stay online for hours, competing with others for registration opportunities. And trust, which is what we talked about. The trust, the idea that once again, Black people will be guinea pigs, and the misinformation is very pervasive now that the vaccine will kill people of African descent in the West. At first, they were saying it would kill us in a year, it will kill us 6 months. Now they're saying it's going to kill you in 3 years, which actually, you know, sort of reminds me of doomsday clock. You know, it's 1999 and it's 2010 and 2020, and it moves out as the deadline comes and nothing happens. And that's what's happening, you know, because we didn't trust the mainstream and mainstream media and mainstream science, we became vulnerable to alternative sources of information that itself should be undeserving of trust, but we have a lower sort of standard. We hold them to a lower standard than we hold science. And that's the contradiction of the moment. Yeah,
it's really interesting that the common themes that are sort of emerging both from the introductory statements and from these questions. And one of the things, Suzanne, turning to you, actually, before I turn to Suzanne, I want to remind the audience that we would love to see your questions coming in. So I'll ask Suzanne one, then I'll turn to the audience questions, and then come back and make sure everyone gets a chance to speak as well. One of the things that Akwatu was talking about really is getting back to these social determinants of health, which you mentioned in your opening statement. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about the importance of those social determinants. And speaking from the perspective of someone working with the city, what is it that our cities, who are also sort of a target of distrust to some extent, how can the cities themselves play a role in helping to overcome the distrust and the stigma and moving people forward through the pandemic? And what, from your perspective, what are the most critical systemic reforms really that we should be taking to make sure that we're going to move forward both in the short term and the long term?
I think we need. Oh, sorry, I thought you were talking to me.
Go ahead, Akwatu.
Sorry.
No, I just very quickly, race-based data across all sectors, especially health. We shouldn't have to fight to get race-based data in health using the OHIP. It's easy, but we still have to fight. But we have it in Ontario, we have it in education, child welfare, and criminal justice. We need it in housing. We need it in employment. We need it in universities. We need it across the board, because if we don't have it, we won't know what the scope and the scale of the disparities. Yes. And we're relying on anecdotes and, but once you get it, you still need a narrative, right? Because evidence isn't what drives policy by itself. You still need a narrative, but without the evidence, it's not important.
Yeah, and I'll just interrupt one time before I turn it back to Suzanne to follow on that, because one of the issues that comes up in all of these conversations is you need to get the right kind of data coming in, right? So you don't just need race-based data, but you need the right kind of race-based data or diversity data, because garbage in, garbage out, right? And so the way that I come from the United States originally, and so in the United States, our reporting is very much more broken down in terms of different kinds of groups, backgrounds and groups. Whereas I was stunned, we weren't even allowed to ask for some of these bits of data in research or in health when I first arrived in Canada. And even now, the main categories, there's Indigenous and there's other racialized groups. Everyone's lumped together. And it's not necessarily the case that all of those communities are going to be feeling equal kinds of issues or having equal kinds of problems. I mean, so for example, AAA negative breast cancer has a much higher chance of impacting women of African Caribbean descent than it does women of Asian descent, but they both would fall in that one category. So if you don't break it down in the right way, you're not going to get the right kind of data. And then of course, Suzanne, to your point, coming from a broader equity lens and working in women's issues, there's also issues of intersectionality that need to be addressed. So I'll turn it back over to you to address these really simple problems to solve for everyone today.
Thank you, Allison. So I want to start from the premise that even in the best of times, structural discrimination exists, and it tends to worsen inequalities, particularly inequalities around access. And in this instance, access to healthcare, as well as access to treatment. We heard earlier about how the rollout of the vaccines, even that, had issues of access and inequity and who was getting, the good vaccines or who was getting vaccinated first and could get back and go on with their lives. And it's not a unique situation that we find ourselves in. I mean, there is ample evidence throughout history that it is usually the marginalized communities who are disproportionately impacted by health crises like the one that we're experiencing now. And even when you look at data, Akwatu spoke about the need to collect data and accurate and collect data effectively so that we know exactly who's getting the short end of the stick, so to speak. But just in terms of the data that has already been collected, when we look at data from Toronto Public Health, for instance, and look at the cases, we see immediately that it is ethno-racial groups and racialized communities that make up almost, I think it was over 80% of reported COVID cases, even though they account for less than half of that city's population. So it's quite instructive that we're seeing the data, even though we haven't really scratched the surface of really getting robust data sets together. The data that has been already collected is pointing us very clearly to the fact that these inequities exist. And for me, coming from an equity lens, I think 2020 and 2021, for various reasons, not only COVID, but the other pandemic that we've been seeing, racism, discrimination, anti-Indigenous sentiment, those other pandemics that we have yet to really focus on, they now provide us with an opportunity to recalibrate and to really examine the ways in which socioeconomic, political, and cultural structures and systems have historically deprived large segments of the global population. This is not unique to Canada, and perhaps Arun will speak more directly to this. But globally, when we think of marginalized populations, how do we now start to dismantle those systems that have, and I'll use, I guess, a contentious word, privileged or offered advantage to certain groups that other, groups could not access. So you have in the pandemic now a situation where, people don't have access to safe or adequate housing, financial resources, technology, even the very ability to work from home or to effectively social distance. So how do we now create systems that really interrogates and problematizes the situation we find ourselves in? And you raised the point, Allison, of intersectionality. And I think that is one of the first things that we need to consider. We want to dismantle these systems of oppression and, isolation and so on. But when we think about it, we have to remember social inequities are never the result of only one factor. So I think to respond adequately, we need to appreciate the complexity of intersectionality. And I think through that appreciation, we get a better sense of, okay, what's really going on here? And in tandem with race-based and, a more robust data collection procedure, we will start to see that the various aspects of individuals' identities are never mutually exclusive. So in addition to age, which was the first sort of determinant, people were saying, okay, well, this is a virus that affects the elderly population more severely. But in addition to age, how does it affect racialized groups who are older? How does it affect the Indigenous community? How does it affect people living in particular economic pockets? So I think we really need to look at that level of intersectionality. And as we plan for life post the pandemic, we really need to have, and again, I'll use a term that some may think cliched, have those courageous conversations, those critical conversations in terms of how are we going to transform an economic system that really delivers on social justice, in terms of a healthy planet. And we've been hearing about different models for building back better. So I think we have to really get to a point of intentionality of what does that build look like? What will that building back look like? How will we ensure that equity for women, for immigrants, for racialized groups, for the Indigenous community, for the LGBTQ community, accessing reproductive health care, for instance, which was a challenge during the last 18 months. How are we going to ensure that access and access to making, decisions about one's health and one's ability to live well, that, health and wellness, how are we going to ensure that everybody's going to have equitable access to participating in that process, to ensure that, in the instance that this happens again, we can really say and mean that we're all in this together.
And I think you've raised a lot of really important issues, and one of them obviously is linked really very much directly to Arn's perspective of the global situation, because when you talk about we're all in this together, or we're actually all I loved your phrasing that you had.
We're in the
where you
same
said,
storm.
we're in the same storm, but not in the same
boat.
boat, right? And that's true locally and globally as well. I'm wondering, Aaron, if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of taking that global perspective, because as you and others have noted now, that we're not battling COVID and issues of health equity in a vacuum. It's a global pandemic, and racism, anti-Indigenous sentiment, those are also global pandemics. And we need to think globally as well as locally. So what is it that you think that we need to do to ensure that we can reach, in previous conversations, we've talked about needing to reach a goal of 50% or more vaccination globally to achieve so-called herd immunity. And why is that important in Canada when we're hearing all this great news about, we've gotten, over, what, 75% now of people with first shots in arms, and we're heading toward, 25-30% of second shots. So it seems like within Canada, we're doing quite well. Why should we care about what's happening globally? And what can we do to protect everybody's health until we reach that global goal? And you want to get off mute.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
I think that's a very important question. If you look at the way this particular virus or any pandemic viruses in the past have traveled, they were not contained in one local area. So what happened in Wuhan in December of 2019 has almost shut the whole world for over 15 months. And all of us are paying a price. And if the whole world has got to come back to normal, then everyone must be protected from this virus. And as much as we are smart to identify new ways to do it, the virus is getting smarter and smarter. It's taking different mutations. So that is why the equity issue in terms of global equity, so everybody gets vaccinated, is important. And I'm just going to refer back to a statement that Akwato mentioned during his presentation, that the vaccine hesitancy comes because a vaccine is produced so quickly. But scientifically, that's not true. Many of these vaccines are in development for over 10 years. Many of them have been in development for cancer treatment. But that seems to work now. And not only that, all the governments have come together in a collaborative mode, and they've accelerated the approval process. And science is not compromised. And unless every single person on earth is vaccinated, we will not achieve that comfort level that we used to enjoy before 2019. It's absolutely critical. While Canada is enjoying over 65% of people being vaccinated, as Allison mentioned, there are parts of the world, particularly in African countries, they are vaccinated only 1.5% of their population, even with one single dose. And there are multiple different vaccines available. Although Canada is not a producer of vaccine, we are fortunate to import and make it available to all our population. But even then, if people are hesitant, then it is the responsibility of the community leaders to address them, to make sure that people take the vaccination. So we have got to reduce the reproduction rate of vaccine, or the so-called R0. At the peak of it, it was going from 1% to 100 persons. And we want to reduce that to the level of either 1 to 1 minimum, so we can contain, so that everybody is safe. That's why the global perspective is much more important and it doesn't sacrifice anything on the local issues or the marginalized population. And I'm so glad Stephen mentioned that the indigenous communities have been put in the front line to receive their vaccines. I think that kind of an inequity should be addressed, and everybody's life matters.
And one of the things that's really sort of following exactly from that is a question that's come in from our audience, and I would urge other folks to start putting more questions. We've got a number that are in there, and we'll try to get to those now. And this is really open for everyone, but when Stephen mentioned about putting Indigenous communities first or near first in many cases, that was viewed by many folks with great appreciation and an understanding of we need to address the needs from a health perspective, but it also had a political element to it. And there was quite a lot of blowback, both against politicians who were supporting this and also against the public health authorities, making it sound like it was a political decision as opposed to a health decision. And the question that came in from the attendees, an anonymous attendee, is why did vaccine rollouts become driven by politics rather than being treated as a health issue? And I think in part there that's got to do not necessarily with exactly this issue, but in that case, that issue, it was turned into a political issue, even though it was being driven by health. And I would just add a follow-up question for all of you, which is what can we do to make sure that moving forward, whether it's this pandemic or we will have future pandemics and other issues, how do we get people to focus on health, the public health side of things, as that's the driving force, as opposed to the politics? So, Stephen, I don't know if you want to start in that answer, and then everyone else who's interested, just jump in.
Sure, thanks. And I'm going to say that it may sound easy hosting an Indigenous vaccination clinic, but it's partnership. And the only way anything is achieved is through partnership. And not only is it partnership, but it's Indigenous led. So in this particular instance, the region had to take not a backseat, but had to support us in order to support Indigenous people, because we have the trust. The region and the health system doesn't have the trust. And even the systems, and if you think about all the data systems and all of the things that you have to fill in and complete, there's a lack of trust, again, as I mentioned, of Indigenous people saying, I am Indigenous. So the stuff we have to put in our place was, we had our own navigators who registered all the Indigenous people. It was a partnership between public health and some Indigenous people that were the injectors. It was managing our system and creating our own space that was a safe space for Indigenous people. And it's through the partnership that actually enabled all of that, but with us taking a lead. And I think that's absolutely critical. Let's turn on to the other people.
I think Arun, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I just want to follow up on what Stephen was mentioning about the trust. And most people don't want to say what their background is. That is because they feel that they're being discriminated. From the health perspective, it is not discrimination. It is a genetic background. Not all of us have got the same genetic code or the way we will be affected. I think from that perspective, if you tell what your background is, then we can work specifically address to that community. I think that kind of a knowledge base, it all depends where the question is coming from. And when you talk about political, anything you say, anything you do, it is being politicized. So yeah, we cannot isolate a public health as a public health measure alone. But whatever you do, if you do, you're damned. If you don't, you're damned. I think that's the situation we are in. And this is where we have got to use our common sense and equity lens.
Yeah. Suzanne and Akwati, you want to chime in? So let's turn to Suzanne next.
Yes, I wanted to say that health is political. And I just made a few notes I'll refer to. I think while we appreciate that all lives are important, it is precisely because historically we have seen where some lives have not been treated with equal importance as others that we're now in the situation that we're in. So for me, the response has to consider that historical aspect. And I think now, if we're really thinking about building back better, we have to give priority to those lives that have been historically denied access, that have been historically been treated as not as important as others. So for me, health is political, big P and little p. And the response must take that into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And Akwatu.
Two things. Public opinion matters, and a well-informed public can change the course of policy and decision-making by government, as was the case around the policing suggestion of the government, which people pushed back on. I mean, the police chiefs themselves said they didn't want the role that the government was going to assign to them to police COVID and vaccine. And so that's one. And context matters. And, you know, when we did the race-based data standard for Ontario, we developed training for how to ask the questions in a way that addresses some of the sensitive issues around identity, around racialization, around not reifying race, because, you know, you want to be sure that people knows that you don't recognize race as a biological reality, but as a social construct, with real socioeconomic implications, and that the purpose of collecting race-based data or any other demographic data really is to address equity. And that's the singular purpose. And once you provide people with that context, 95% of persons asked will give you their data. If they know privacy is protected, confidentiality is protected, and it's a singular use equity. Most people will actually give you their data. But if they think that it could be used to stigmatize the community or re-stigmatize the community, they'll hesitate. If they think that it's not, their privacy won't be protected, it won't be confidential, some metadata group will get a hold of it, next thing you know, they'll be getting social media messaging from private companies, they won't give it. So once you can provide assurances and context, I believe you can actually get the data that's needed for race equity purposes. And by the way, one of the things that you have to do is tell people, we recognize that race is not a biological reality. Right. And our goal in this is to remove race as a factor in your health status, as well as in the healthcare that you receive.
Yeah, and that, I think you've done a good job answering one of the questions that we had in the Q&A, which was, what can we do to have people feel more comfortable in answering these questions about race and background, so that we can collect the right data. Stephen, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in also, if you thought that there might be other ways of addressing that issue, specifically within the Indigenous population, because in your opening statements, you were talking about being able to hide in plain sight and things like that. And self-identification is an important issue also in Indigenous communities.
And I'm going to just say that it all boils down to trust. And I talked about the systems that don't have trust, and that's not going to change anytime soon. There's 500 years of really negative things that afflicted Indigenous people that causes a lack of trust, right? And so one of the things that organizations who want to work with Indigenous populations will have to do is build that partnership and let Indigenous organizations like ours or others take the lead and build the trust for them and act as that sort of bridge piece. And even with information, I have had these, I guess I'll call them arguments, with systems where they wanted the data and we simply won't give them the data. Otherwise, we won't even have the people. So we register them all through our center as the address, because otherwise all those other issues, police, family and children's services, come into play, right? And it's unfortunate, but I think with reconciliation, And I look at reconciliation, nothing has been done since the action items came out. I mean, I can say that 92.2 simply says equity in the workplace. What equity in the workplace has taken place in the last 6 years. And if you wanted to achieve equity, all you have to do is look at your turnover rates or your growth rates and simply allocate some of those jobs to Indigenous people or racialized groups. And that would have created equity. And it's not equity at the entry level, it's equity throughout every level of the organization, right? Including the boards that actually influence the direction of organizations. And without that happening, and I would also go beyond that and say, without culture being changed and going back and looking at all the policies and all the processes, which are in fact the barriers, unless you change that, you're not going to change anything. And that's only part of it, right? So the culture piece, building trust, and fixing your own systems.
Yeah,
A lot
thanks so
of
much. Yeah, we have so many really interesting questions coming in. I'm gonna try to turn 3 of them into one question because I see them as being related, and then I'll turn 2 more into sort of your final comments. So one question, this is sort of a merging of a question that's come in from Andrew Yoshioka, Dan Wasserman, and I think it's those 2 really. Andrew's asking about, Canada and the provinces are moving more toward greater use of genetic testing for precision medicine. And obviously, there's going to be issues around privacy and data that are there as well. And Dan Wasserman asks about the politicization of messages and is wondering, about employing or engaging more key opinion leaders for various populations to become spokespeople. And Andrew also says, what can be done to engage more underrepresented communities. And Akwatu, in your opening statements, you were mentioning, for example, the case of Idris Elba and how when he came out as, yes, actually Black people can get COVID and I have it, as a sort of a key opinion leader in some ways, that drove people's behavior change. So I'm wondering if what you all think about the importance of engaging key opinion leaders within specific populations and other ways to engage underrepresented communities to enhance the sense of trust so that we can move forward through COVID and other pandemics.
Let me jump in if it's okay, Allison. The data is necessary to address the issue. Without the data, we cannot provide a proper solution. That is why I was just listening to an all-panel pharmaceutical and the lawmakers in the US yesterday. And now the new system of collecting data for the vaccine rollouts and even for Delta variants and all the stuff. And now they're saying that you should have representation of communities, representation of different racial ethnic groups, so that when the results come, you can homogenize it or you can make it available to people around the world. And as much as we are concerned about the racial identity, which are unfortunately used for the purposes not intended for, I think that the trust issue comes. We need to address very quickly so that we can find the solutions to everyone on earth. I think this is where the collective efforts, collective integrity of managing and using the data for the purpose for which it's collected and advancing the science.
Thanks. And I think that's a good point to end on. We could go on for hours, but I know we're coming to the end, and I want to give everyone a chance to give some sort of final thoughts. And what would be helpful is if, in summarizing today's conversation, if you can each just very quickly say 2 things. What can those of us with great privilege do to help to decrease vaccine hesitancy and urge the need for health care equity. And so people in the position of allies, for example, what can allies do, keeping in mind that it should always be not to and for, but by and with. But then also, what would your final call to action be for everyone here in general, just so we can help move closer to a world that has vaccine access for all and health equity for all more generally? And let's maybe go in reverse order of how we started. So we'll start with Arun on that.
Wow.
Final call for action, and what can we do to help?
Well, there are two things that are important that emerges. Number one, each and every one of us have within ourselves to be a community leader, to be trusted by our own community, and provide the evidence-based information, not the WhatsApp information, evidence-based information, and make people understand that we are living in pandemic and we all have got to get out of this storm, as Suzanne nicely put it. We have got to get out of this storm, and that means every one of us need to do collectively to make people understand what the situation is and how we can get out, number one. And number two, the nations and within the nations, the states and provinces should come together in a collaborative mode rather than pulling apart. And I would love to see that the vaccination throughout the world to go up to 50% or more, so that we can minimize that so-called R0 or the reproduction rate. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Suzanne.
So I think in going forward, we need to use privilege, as the question asked, to create spaces for voices that have been historically silenced. We need to allow those voices to be amplified now. I also think we need to consider issues like intersectionality, social determinants of health, understand how the categories that we have established, like race, are really social constructs that order us in hierarchies that are unnecessary and that ultimately need to be dismantled. I would also want to see, in Building Back Better, that we really think about how the social systems and structures that are currently in place, that I think we can all agree are not working well for a large majority of populations. How do we build them back in a way that they, in terms of health, ensure harm and minimization, they're for the public benefit, they protect privacy, they are transparent, and in terms of a broader social equity issue, that they are transparent, they are equitable, and that they really help to move us towards more just societies.
Thank you so much. And Akwatu.
4 quick points. Influence decision makers to translate an equity commitment into a meaningful, concrete element of vaccine rollout, vaccine passports, global vaccine equity. The vaccine rollout, equity in March, equity in March, then it's equity when pharmacies, equity in April, then it's May, no equity. Back to June, we got equity. In July, maybe we won't have equity. There needs to be consistency of commitment to equity. Otherwise, it won't work. Because when you are inconsistent, it fuels the mistrust. People actually take that as, you see what I told you? These guys aren't serious. Now we're talking about moving into vaccine passport. And what surprises me is the focus on the technological aspects of the vaccine passport, as opposed to what does history tell you about passports and passes and how they can be used to increase disparities and further marginalized populations who are already vulnerable, who actually, because they're under-vaccinated, will be subject to greater policing scrutiny and actually greater policing. And it's so predictable. So equity has to inform that discussion. And globally, there'll be no solution unless equity informs the discussion. We have thankfully been able to secure more vaccines than the population actually needs. We have a surplus of vaccination commitments because we had the money to buy it. Well, it's a global pandemic, and unless we commit a share of that vaccine surplus that we have in real time, meaningfully to the low-income countries of the world, and start distributing it now, not in 2023 or 2024, now, because we got Delta plus.
Yes,
we have
yes.
Delta plus. Who the hell knows? But what we know is we got to stop it before it gets there. And the only way to do that is to take an equity approach towards our own care, that it's not just about us, it's about all those different boats in the storm that are
Yes.
trying to stabilize them so they don't
all different types. Yes. Great, thanks. And last word to Stephen then.
Thank you. And from my perspective, what I see, we have 100 years, well, we have 500 years of course, issues with Indigenous people. And I'll just look at even just the last 100 years when we've been more industrialized and all the processes that have been put in place. And if you think about all the barriers that have been created in all of those various systems, things haven't changed. I mean, they really haven't changed in 500 years. They haven't changed in the last 100 years or the last 10 or the last 5. I think they changed a little bit in this past like 6 months with the pandemic, or since March when we started doing our vaccinations. I find that most often governments, organizations put band-aids on things. I know we're talking about healthcare right now, but it's band-aid solutions. And from our perspective, everything we do is really related to proactive solutions and looking at root cause rather than looking at symptoms. And if we continue with the same processes, we're going to get the same outcomes. That's just what a process happens to be. And unless we turn it all on its head and say, let's start over and rebuild, and how do we engage with these populations in a different way, either through partnership or through the racialized groups being the leader in that partnership, I don't think it's going to change much. And from my perspective, not only is it not going to change much, but until organizations and systems do the actual work of fixing their systems and fixing their cultures and what they permiss and what they don't permiss from an employee engagement with the client's perspective, nothing's going to change. And that's, I'm not saying that's hard work, it's just building talent. I used to be a talent management guru, so I spent a lot of time doing transformations in corporate Canada. And it's just fixing HR programs or management programs. It's not hard work. It's 2 or 3 years worth of work. It's building systems and structures, and then going and doing the harder work of culture change. But if we don't do that, the next time, it's not this time, because this time is Band-Aids. It's how can we do it next time? How can we deal with this going forward? And I guess in terms of this, I'd just like to thank everyone for the opportunity to be able to participate and share our views from an Indigenous perspective on this panel.
Thank you. Thank you for your words of wisdom. Thank you to all the panelists for all of your incredible insights. And I think that we leave the morning session knowing that there is quite a lot of real work still to be done, but with a little bit of hope, perhaps, that there is a path forward. And I think that your own personal commitment from each of you to enhancing vaccine access and health equity more generally, I think serves as both an inspiration and an imperative for every one of us here to play our part in doing that real work. I'm thinking of it as turning Band-Aids into boats, or moving from Band-Aids to boats is really what we need to be doing. And I want to just also say thank you to the Life Sciences Organization, LSO, for hosting this important conversation and for all the work that you do in advancing equity in life sciences more broadly. And I'll turn it back to you, Jason. Thank you to everyone for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Allison, and thank you to all the panelists. That was fantastic. I know we're just scratching the surface of this very important topic, and now that I have met you all and have got to know you a little bit more, I hope you don't mind. I will be reaching out and staying in touch, and hopefully getting your support as we continue this really important dialogue. in the future. So thank you again for all of your time and sharing your experience and insight. And thank you to all the participants. We have just a few quick announcements. I know we're over time, so I'll make this really quick. Brian, just a couple upcoming events. Well, first of all, just thank you to all of our sponsors and supporters, our platinum sponsors, as well as our gold sponsors and our silver sponsors. And without the support of all of these organizations, we really couldn't host events like this. So appreciate their support, the support of our members, and of course, the support of all the panelists for donating their time to this conversation. Thank you to all that attended. Have a great day.
Thank you.